All right, well, oof, we're hot. We are, it feels a little odd to be here in front of you guys. I think as we go through life, we experience these things that feel like they're reserved for other people somehow, maybe older, smarter, more qualified people. And, a few of these times that I've experienced this have been, the first day of teaching school or getting married. I imagine it's a little bit like you might feel when you have kids and giving a topic on the breastplate of righteousness. So, no, I'm kidding, sort of. A while back, Caleb asked me to speak on the breastplate of righteousness or the armor of God. And when I heard armor of God, I was like, okay, we can do that. And then he asked me to speak on the breastplate of righteousness. And like a number of things were going through my head. One of them was dread. Just because I was like, well, what even is the breastplate of righteousness? And can I get a sword? And so that's a little bit of what I was feeling going into this. As kids, we were big Lord of the Rings fans. Are there any Lord of the Rings fans and people in here? Less than I hoped. So hopefully these analogies don't fall short here, but I think they'll make sense regardless. So as kids, we were big fans, and we were growing up in the era of time when the movies were coming out. So the books were written for a long time prior to the movies, and Dad would have read us the Hobbit. So the Hobbit is like the prequel to the three main books there, and he would have read us the Hobbit as like a bedtime story over a number of weeks or months or whatever it was. And so our whole family was big fans, and then as the movies came out, Dad would require us to, of course, we had to read the books before we were allowed to watch the movies. And we did. I mean, there was some aggressive skimming that happened at a few parts, but we read the books, and we read them well enough that we could actually tell you, like when the movie strayed from the storyline of the books, I said, well, that's not actually how it actually happened in the books, So we were like nerds to that level. And when we got the movies, we got the extended versions. And the extended versions include a whole separate DVD where all it was like the behind the scenes of how the movie was made. And we would spend more time watching that along with the battles, the battle scenes in the movies than we would actually watching the rest of it there. So all that to say, maybe that speaks a little bit to our human nature, of what we enjoy or what we look for. As kids, we would always take different roles of these characters. And if you were Aragorn, you had a big wooden sword made of scrap lumber from the garage. If you were Gimli, you had Dad's wood chopping axe. If you were Legolas, you had a bow and arrow, and we slayed many a cattail and goldenrod in the backyard. So, I think we look for something aggressive, or at least I do. I seem like when I heard the breastplate, I was like, well, this sounds kind of boring and defensive somehow. And yet, it's all preparing us for action, for battle. And so I want to do a couple things here this morning. I have a couple questions to answer, or to address, maybe not answer, but questions that I had along with questions that I found with some research I did as well. And just to recap first, though, a little bit of what Caleb shared. Caleb shared about, was it 3 or 4 weeks ago or so? Now it's been a minute since we've had the last topic, but introduced the topic of the armor of God. And so one question that he asked, and I want to start there, is who is the enemy and what are the tactics of the enemy? And so we'll read the passage here in a second, but I want to first read an excerpt from a book that Caleb read from as well, Winning the War in Your Mind by Craig Groeschel. And I'll just read this excerpt and then continue here on. It says, picture a battle with two opposing sides. Now imagine that the people on one side don't realize that they're involved in a battle. The enemy is attacking and taking them out, picking them off one by one, but they are oblivious. Hard to imagine because it's just too absurd? I agree. But every day you are engaged in a battle. Are you aware of it? You may not recognize the battle you're in while it's wreaking havoc in your life. Ever wonder why you can't shake a bad habit? Why you feel like you can't connect with God? Why you lose your temper so easily? Why do you often make bad decisions? Why you and your spouse fight so much? Why you're consumed with worry, fear, and negativity? And here's one of the greatest tactics. It says, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist. Satan doesn't want you to believe in him, so he works subtly. Doesn't want him being God. He knows that if you ignore him, he can invade your mind with impunity, with indifference. He can plant seeds of doubt, confusion, worry, depression, anxiety that will continue to grow. And if you ignore the battle, you lose the battle. So again, that was from Winning the War in Your Mind by Craig Groeschel. I think I'm pronouncing his last name correctly there. But I think when we look at the tactics of the devil and the forces of evil, we see the obvious ones, right? You see death and war and hardship and loss and bad things happening to good people, right? You see those clear and definite signs that we live in a fallen world that I guess you could say is longing for redemption, right? That's the reality we live in. And those big things are clear, and yet often I think like the real ways that, at least for me, one of the biggest ways I think that Satan can get into my life is through inaction, just simple inaction there. And we walk through our lives saying, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. Like out of this list of things I'm not supposed to do, I'm not doing those, right? But we're actually not doing anything else either. And so that's my tendency. I think one of the ways that I think an argument could be made that it's one of the greatest tactics is simply inaction. And don't hear me saying that we need to add a lot more to our schedules or something like that. When I moved to this community here, it's been about 5 years now, one of the things I realized really quickly is that you guys operate at a high rate of speed. And so I don't know that adding tons of things is the answer here, but I think there's plenty to add within our current responsibilities here of what it means to fight the battle of the kingdom here. And maybe it is that we can do more. I'm sure there's opportunity for that as well. But I think going back to the whole armor versus weapons thing here, right? Either way, we're preparing for action. It's a battle we're facing here. And so when we look at this breastplate of righteousness, we want to talk about the action that is taking place here. So if you would, go ahead and turn to the passage here. It's Ephesians 6, and we'll dive into that a little bit. We'll read verses 10 to 14. 10 is where it picks up talking about the armor of God, and 14 is the verse that talks about the breastplate of righteousness, so we'll read those verses there. It says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness." Okay, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is the breastplate of righteousness. So I mentioned earlier when I heard what I was supposed to talk about, the breastplate of righteousness, kind of had no clue where to start. And so I thought, well, I'll just write down some questions I have about it as I look at it, and then I also wrote down again some questions from some other places as well. And the first question I asked there is, what is the significance of the breastplate? Okay, now if you Google the breastplate of righteousness, you will get like 3 pages of blog posts and videos of people making the significance of it, the breastplate itself, the article of armor. And I think there is probably some significance into that. You think of a breastplate, right? A breastplate was something that would cover your torso, usually your neck to your waist, depending on the design of the armor. And depending on the artist's depiction, it might even include a nice little six-pack molded into the the armor itself. But the reality is it was there to protect your torso, right? And that's where our vital organs are. And so a lot of the teaching you'll see on this, or at least that I found on it, were like, that's why righteousness is attached to the breastplate being one of the most important articles of armor. And so while that may be true, and if we're going to if I can make one more Lord of the Rings reference here, it's actually a torso-protecting article of armor that protects Frodo from dying early on in his journey there. So maybe we can make some analogies there as well. But I think the armor article, it may be significant, but Paul is actually likely referencing a passage in Isaiah here when he uses the terminology, the breastplate of righteousness, and even some of the other articles of armor as well. So if you would, one more passage I'd like to look at here is Isaiah 59. Isaiah 59 is kind of in the middle of a section of prophecy. In fact, it's a very powerful passage. Isaiah 59 is talking about how God is recognizing maybe the lack of justice, of righteousness in the world, and it's talking about how he plans to solve that and redeem that by sending a Redeemer, or sending Jesus. Picking up in verse 14 there is where I'd like to start there. It says, the section there is called Judgment and Redemption. In the ESV, they give it that title. In verse 14, it says, "Justice is turned back, and righteousness stands far away, for truth has stumbled in the public squares, and uprightness cannot enter. Truth is lacking, and he who departs from evil makes himself a prey. The Lord saw it, and it displeased him, and that there was no justice. He saw that there was no man, and wondered that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought him salvation, and his righteousness upheld him. He put on righteousness as a breastplate," and that's where we see the reference there, "and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put on garments of vengeance for clothing, and wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. According to their deeds, so will he repay. Wrath to his adversaries, repayment to his enemies. To the coastlands he will render repayment, so that they shall fear the name of the Lord from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun. For he will come like a rushing stream, which the wind of the Lord drives." And we'll stop there, but if you read on in 20 and 21, he speaks of the coming Redeemer, the coming of Jesus there after that. So back in verse 17, you'll notice, again, it says, "He put on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation." Both of those were articles that are mentioned in Paul's armor of God section, right? And so Paul, likely being pretty well versed in like the Old Testament scriptures and things, would have known this passage likely, and so it makes sense that he uses it as something that to reference there. Either way, we recognize breastplate, or if the importance is in the article of the armor, or if he's just simply referencing a previous passage, we recognize righteousness as something that's important. So what is righteousness was my next question there. And here's one that we could easily go deep into the weeds on, I'm sure, but I'll try to keep it fairly straightforward. Again, I don't claim to be an expert at this or fully understand the full extent of righteousness, but I think there's some basic fundamental ideas here bound up in this idea of righteousness here. So bear with me here as I work my way through this here. So what is righteousness? If you look at a definition that you'd find, just a modern dictionary definition, it'd be acting in accord with divine or moral law, free from guilt or sin. Okay, so righteousness being just free from guilt or sin. In Scripture, we see it in a few different contexts. It often carries the idea of innocence and justice. Usually the words justice and righteousness, it's pretty often that they come together, used in the same idea. It's used as an attribute of God. So God is described as a righteous God. We could also maybe say a just God there as well. And it's used to describe obedience, where someone is obeying the call of God. So if someone was a righteous man, we mean that he was following through with what God had called them to do. Okay. If you look, there's a Greek word, and I'm not even going to pretend to know how to pronounce it there, but I'm going to give it a shot. Dikaiosune there, and that hopefully no one knows Greek here in the building, but the definition there is it's defined as the condition or state that is acceptable to God. Okay, so the condition or state that is acceptable to God, and I think it'd be fair to say that we could sum this up by being right with God. Okay, at least that's one way to look at righteousness there. In Genesis 15, I realize that the Old Testament wasn't written in Greek here, but this idea of being right with God is talking about Abraham. It says, and he being Abraham, believed the Lord, and he being God in this case, counted it to him as righteousness. So he believed the Lord, and this is right after he gives him the promise that Abraham has given. Abraham believes, and so therefore Abraham is considered a righteous man as a result of that. So essentially we define righteousness as being right with God. Then here was something interesting else I found was how is righteousness defined differently in the Old Testament versus the New? Or maybe how is righteousness attained differently in the Old Testament versus the New? And in one sense, they're the same, right? At the bottom line is you're living according to how God has called you to live, or you're believing God's promise for you. But there's some pretty important differences in how it's attained. And I think we're probably aware of these, but just to talk a little bit about it there, I mentioned earlier that righteousness is often associated with justice. And when you look at how justice is carried out in the Old Testament, it's often very transactional, right? So like the whole eye for an eye thing, or in some cases, death for an eye, it seems like. But you see, correct ways to eat, correct ways to do sacrifices, extreme punishment. If a man sleeps with another man's wife, he's going to die, or they're both going to die, actually. And so we see very, very transactional righteousness. And then if going back to the correct ways to eat and correct way to do sacrifices, right? You couldn't even go to God yourself, right? You had to go through a priest to get to God. And so to attain righteousness was a very detailed, detail-oriented, transactional process of becoming right with God here in the Old Testament. You contrast that with the righteousness in the New Covenant or the New Testament, and it's a very different type of righteousness in terms of how we attain it, right? Starting with the whole priest thing, right? The veil is torn, right? We can access God directly, and praise God for that for sure. The requirements to be right with God or be righteous is simply believe and live intentionally as God has called us to live. And so we see the drastic difference there in how righteousness is attained. Last question here that I had then was, how does righteousness why is it included as a defense mechanism? So how does righteousness provide a defense? First off, if righteousness is defined as being guilt-free, right, we've all experienced guilt, whether it's currently in our lives, in a past situation as a kid when you stole candy from the store or whenever it was, right, existing with a state of guilt and the shame and the cycle that brings, where it seeps into your life, for lack of a better way to say it, it sucks, right? Like no one enjoys that way of living. And so immediately we've undermined our effectiveness by living with guilt, just acknowledging that. But also righteousness, being right with God, living to how God has called us to live, means we are living exactly as we were created to live. And this is one that I struggle to make sense of or maybe explain clearly here. But when you're living in the way that you were created to live, right, or you're doing what you were created to do, that's where you thrive. And I think the way that righteousness brings, or being right with God brings protection or brings security, is by living exactly as you were called to live, where there's no insecurity about who am I, what am I supposed to do. The anxiety that brings isn't present when you live like that. So I don't know if this has made any sense. I guess just to wrap this up, we look back at the enemy we were fighting, and the very idea that we need to put on armor, it signifies that what we bring ourselves isn't enough. And so I think that's maybe something to acknowledge here in light of all of this. As Paul says in Corinthians, he says, when I am weak, then I am strong, right? Because when we are weak, that's when we acknowledge our need for God. That's when we acknowledge that we simply don't have enough, that we need God. Remembering to guard against inaction. We put on armor here. We're not building a fort, right? I think this is actually pretty important, right? The idea of armor versus building a fort. We're not putting the walls of righteousness and the tower of salvation and the moat of, now I'm forgetting what the other ones are. Someone help me out. Moat of faith. There was one of them there. We're not building a fort, right? We're putting on armor because we are heading into battle. We are taking on action here. So as we look, I guess, to fight against evil, I hope our cry can be the battle belongs to the Lord. And remembering that the work of the Lord happens through his people. And just reading Romans 12:21, I think this is a well-known passage, but it says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good, not fighting back with the same tactics as evil, of course, but returning hatred with love, death with the hope of life, and living that truth out as we go through life. So that's what I have to share about the breastplate of righteousness. I hope it's been encouraging to you guys, and it was good for me to step out of my comfort zone a little bit and dive into this topic. And so thanks for listening to what I had to say.